Hi Year 10, welcome to the final video of the online learning. So this is week 5 and video 7. So there's just one video for this week as well. And next week I will see you all in the classroom. So this is the 1960s. It's got a little bit of things from the 1950s as well in it. Alright, so let's get into it. The 60s was known as the cultural decade, was labelled the swinging 60s because of social taboos. So taboos means like things that aren't really meant to be talked about or done, mainly relating to racism and sexism that occurred. So racism, the discrimination of other races, and sexism, the discrimination of women. It was a revolution about social norms, clothing, music, drugs, sexuality, formalities, and schooling. So there was the Cold War, Vietnam, Bay of Pigs invasion, and the Portuguese War, the Arab-Israeli conflict, the Algerian War, the Nigerian War, Chinese Cultural Revolution, communist protests, and the Troubles. So assassinations, so you'll need to pause it here. So John F. Kennedy, the former US President, 22nd of November 1963. 21st of February 1965, Malcolm X. 4th of April 1968, Dr. Martin Luther King. And the 5th of June 1968, Robert F. Kennedy. That's the brother of John F. Kennedy. There were many also in Africa because of the apartheid, which was like a war between the blacks and whites in the south of Africa. The second half of the decade, young people began to revolt against the conservative norms of the time. This created a counterculture that sparked social revolution throughout the Western world. So this means that the young people weren't happy with how everything was, so they were the ones protesting and starting this social revolution. Began in the United States as a reaction against the conservatism and social conformity of the 1950s and the US government's extensive military intervention in Vietnam. This involved in the popular social aspects of movements became known as hippies. So that was the youth in the 1960s. There's some hippies there. These groups questioned authority and government. They demanded more freedoms and rights for women and minority groups. The movement was also first widespread socially accepted drug use such as LSD and marijuana mixed with music. The war in Vietnam would eventually lead to a commitment of over 500,000 US troops. As the war dragged on, the body count continued to climb. Civil unrest escalated in Australia and the US. Students became a powerful and disruptive force, and university campuses sparked a national debate over the war. A mass movement began rising in opposition to war, including protest music. So this is about Martin Luther King. So he was remembered as one of the great men of the 20th century. He led the US the United States civil rights movement. He was a man who was admired and revered by most people worldwide. So to look at him, you have to look at the racial climate in the US at the time, and further back than that. So pre-1950s, the first slaves were brought to America. There you see, you had the black slaves working for the white people. Once on US soil, slave codes deprived African Americans of all these things, so they couldn't be educated, they couldn't own property, they couldn't testify on their own behalf in court, they couldn't hit a white person, they couldn't vote, and they had no freedom of speech. You can pause that and read that article if you'd like. So in 1776, America declared independence from Britain, but the Declaration of Independence did not refer to slaves. 1790, fewer than 70,000 slaves in the US. In 1830, so that's 40 years later, there were 2 million, and another 30 years later there were 4 million. Abraham Lincoln in 1863 wanted to emancipate slaves, which means get rid of slavery. The proclamation did not change the legality of slavery. This could only happen with a constitutional amendment. The 13th Amendment prohibited slavery. The 14th Amendment guaranteed full rights of citizenship to all male slaves. And 15th Amendment granted the right for everyone to vote, so all adults, but only the males. Theoretically, they had gained their freedoms, rights, and privileges of citizenship. Newly freed slaves had no education, money, or work from home. Emancipation did not translate into freedom.